Hello, welcome back, everybody. What I'm going to talk about today is some tips and tricks on how to write an abstract, which is a really interesting, very important style of writing that also can be a way for you to practice a something that you don't get a lot of chance to practice in college, which is concision. Quickly, what is an abstract and what is it for? So, an abstract is just like a research paper or a oral presentation. It is a way of communicating information about a research topic. It is a way of presenting the information that you found in your research to an audience, therefore it should accomplish the same goals that a full-length research paper would or an oral presentation might. But it's quite specific in that it is usually paired with a full-length research paper, or sometimes an oral presentation, because it might show up, like, say, if you were giving a paper at a conference, you would write it. Usually, you write an abstract for that, and that's what shows up in sort of the program and lets people know whether they want to come to your talk or not. An abstract is a very concise, short form version of a research paper. Is one way to sort of think about it. And they traditionally appear on sort of like the first page of an academic paper that you might find in your research, and it tells you everything about the paper without any detail. So it gives you the whole story of your research paper, usually in a very short amount of words, 200 or 300 or maybe 500 words. That would be quite a long abstract. So for reference, in sort of double-spaced pages, that's anywhere from maybe a half a page to a full page. That length of abstract is used to describe works as long as a dissertation or a book that might be hundreds of pages long. In this case, we're going to be thinking about how do we write an abstract specifically for a sort of undergraduate level research paper, maybe a capstone or a thesis paper that might be anywhere in the range of 8 or so pages to maybe 20 or 30 pages, which would be the length of like a journal article style of writing in graduate school or postgraduate. So we're going to be thinking a little bit about how to write an abstract for that sort of document. So an abstract will usually follow or precede the paper, and it gives a person, including you hopefully used abstracts before in your own research, a chance to very quickly get a snapshot idea of exactly what that paper is about, to help you decide, do I want to sink the time and effort into actually reading this whole paper? Because you can't, of course, read every journal article that's 30 pages or more long, presented to a topic when you're just trying to write an undergraduate research paper. You can't. Nobody has the time for that, right? So you need to have a way to triage, to decide, oh, this is a paper I definitely want to read. This is a paper maybe I don't need to read, or I can put it aside for later. That's what the abstract helps you do. And like I said, for an abstract for an oral presentation, at like a conference, might tell you, at a conference, there's sometimes, 5 or 6 papers happening at the exact same time slot that you want to go to. How do you know which one is really the one that's most important, that you really want to see? The abstract can help you do that, right? Same thing for a dissertation or a book. That really can help you avoid a huge time sink of trying to read an entire book that maybe you don't need to. So that's the goal of an abstract. And like I said, an abstract is all about concision. So I have this question here, why is an abstract so hard to write? I would make an argument to you that an abstract is one of the hardest things to write. They maybe don't take that long to write, but they're very difficult to get right, because you have to achieve a lot in a very small number of words, just sometimes a couple hundred to a few hundred words, or even shorter. A lot of times conference abstracts have a 100-word limit, right? That's very tight. That's really only a couple of sentences, few sentences, to say everything that you need to say. So that makes them difficult to write, but they're a great exercise in learning how to write for concision, how to write tightly. And as you advance through your career of writing, later in your undergraduate, and then certainly if you end up going to graduate school, you're going to find more and more that there's going to be more and more push to get you to learn how to write for concision. I think there's a bit of a mistake at the high school level and the early undergraduate level, and sometimes all through the undergraduate level, of professors pushing their students and teachers pushing their students to write for length. Oh, I want you to write a long paper, 20 pages, 30 pages. And obviously 20 or 30 pages is, people write that length all the time, and I understand why they do it, because that's a sort of a standard length. But sometimes students, you're tempted to just be very verbose, right? To just fill it with fluff and fill it with stuff. There is no opportunity to do that with an abstract. An abstract forces you to use your writing very carefully. It is like a tight poem versus a piece of prose, right? That's maybe waxing a bit poetic, pun intended, about it. But this is like the haiku of research papers, is the abstract, right? It forces you to think very tightly about and very, very carefully about the words that you use. Okay, so let's go through the actual construction of an abstract. And you're going to see that this construction looks very similar to the construction of a broader research paper. And that's because, like I said before, an abstract actually is supposed to achieve the same thing that a whole research paper does, but with less room to do so. So it should have, to start with, a thesis statement. So the first primary element of an abstract is a thesis statement. And supplemental to this, if you so choose, right? So if you have some more space, so say you've got 200 words or 300 words to write instead of 100. Like if you only have 100 words for a conference paper, you're going to just be sticking to these primaries that I give you here, right? Thesis statement, method, so on. But if you've got a little bit more space, it's great to give this supplemental information. So supplemental to the thesis statement, some contextual information and background, almost like a mini literature review. So you're giving it information like, this is where I think my thesis statement fits into the broader literature about this topic. Do I think that I'm tackling a new idea? Am I revisiting an idea that others have talked about before? Am I critiquing the ideas of some other literature that's already out there, maybe some kind of famous literature that you have a criticism of? Where does your topic fall within? So that's supplemental to the thesis statement. The second primary important aspect of an abstract is the methodology. So that's the methodology is, how are you going to answer your thesis statement or solve your thesis statement? Or your thesis statement can sometimes be called a research question. So you've got a research question, the methodology, how are you actually going to answer it? And supplemental to that, you can make an argument for your methodology or against another methodology, right? So why did you choose your methodology? You might have a sentence about that versus maybe some other standard methodology. We decided to do this instead of that because X, Y, and Z. You might have space to do that in a sentence or two. And then finally, the final two primaries. First is findings. So your findings are what did you discover? What were the results of this? Is something that's called results of your thesis statement and your methodology. And supplement to that, you might have a statement of surprise, or maybe not so much. We were surprised to find X, or it turned out our findings were quite in line with previous studies. Y. Neither of those is better than the other. That's good science, right? The science should just be telling us what you found. How does that fit into work that's come before? And then the last primary is conclusions, right? So this is also sometimes called your interpretation. So you should preview your conclusions and interpretations, right? So thesis statement, methodology, findings, conclusions. The four, I would say, most important elements of any research paper. They're the most important elements of an abstract as well. One of the things that I teach when I talk about any research writing is the importance of something that I call linkage, a concept that I call linkage. Linkage is that the reader should be able to draw, or the listener, if you're giving a presentation, should be able to draw the logical links that connect all the different primary parts of your paper. Your research question or thesis statement should have a logical connection to the methodology. It should have a logical connection to the results. It should have a logical connection to your conclusions or your interpretations, right? You should be able to follow that chain, right? So it might look something like this. Your thesis should logically, your methodology needs to be a question that can actually a method that can actually answer the question in your thesis. Your findings should actually be something that resulted from that methodology. Your conclusions should be a logical set of conclusions based on the findings, right? There should be linkage between each of these elements. And if there isn't, if there's a break in this chain, then the argument of your paper will fall apart. You need to, this is incredibly difficult to achieve. It's really hard. This is high-level stuff. And the challenge, again, with an abstract is you still have to do this, except you've got to do it in this tiny little bit of space. You have to do it in just a couple of hundred words. So it's an extra challenge. What I want to do now is give you an example. This is a real abstract from one of my own papers. This is an abstract written by myself and a couple of co-authors that's published in a real academic journal. So this was a successful abstract, we might say. It's not necessarily the greatest example of an abstract in the world. It's certainly not the worst example of an abstract in the world, but it is an example of an abstract that I've pulled out to use as an example for you here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read it twice. I'll read it quickly for you. You can just listen to it. And then I'm going to use these colors that you see above to highlight where each of these elements shows up, how I've broken them out, and hopefully we can see how they logically lead one into another. So quickly, so this is an archaeology paper. We compared domestic architectural features in archaeological New England and the Maritime Peninsula to investigate the relationship between the adoption of horticulture and social and settlement change during the Woodland period. Horticulture was not practiced on the Maritime Peninsula until after European contact, despite cultural and environmental similarity to New England. In New England, horticulture has been implicated in profound social and settlement changes. However, aggregated villages, a unit typically investigated for evidence of social change, have proven elusive in the archaeological record. We analyzed an aggregated data set of dwelling features instead of relying on identifiable villages. The novel quantitative approach uses dwelling feature shape and size as a proxy for social and settlement change, considering these changes at the scale of the house. We find that during the Woodland period, dwelling size was overall slightly larger in New England than on the Maritime Peninsula, but ranges heavily overlapped. After the introduction of horticulture, however, dwellings in New England grew in size overall and assumed bimodally distinct larger and smaller forms, which likely necessitated a restructuring of social and economic behavior. This pattern correlates maize horticulture with changes in social and economic lifestyle in late Woodland New England. Okay, so that's a mouthful. I hope you were sort of following along with that and just thinking a little bit about, can you spot the thesis in here? Can you spot the method? Can you spot the findings and the conclusion? And what I'm going to do now is just highlight for you what I think those are, right? So the primary thesis: we compared domestic architectural features in archaeological New England and the Maritime Peninsula to investigate the relationship between the adoption of horticulture and social and settlement change during the Woodland period. So we did not choose to put this in the form of a question, although you could, and many people do. So a thesis statement or a research question can be framed either way. We've framed it as a statement. This is our thesis. We want to look at the relationship between these different things. Thesis supplemental, right? So remember, this is a little bit of that contextual information to place our thesis within a broader body of work and a long history of scholars thinking about these questions. Horticulture was not practiced on the Maritime Peninsula until after European contact, despite cultural and environmental similarity to New England. That's a little contextual information. So is this in New England, horticulture has been implicated in profound social and settlement changes. A little bit of contextual information on what some of these terms actually mean and some of the literature. However, aggregated villages, a unit typically investigated for evidence of social change, have proven elusive in the archaeological record. That's a bit of a sort of making the case for our thesis. Why is this important? Why do we care about this topic, right? So that's something else you can do with this little bit of supplement. So this is like a little gray area that many abstracts have, and I've certainly used here. Is we've got a little bit of space here to just give our readers a little bit of context to engage with our topic, right? And explain a bit of jargon and a little bit of historical time framing and things like that. Second, the primary method. We analyze an aggregated data set of dwelling features instead of relying on identifiable villages. Really simple. We analyzed an aggregated data set of dwelling features, right? That's it. I don't give you any more information about that. If you want to know more about what that means, that's what the paper's for. And then we go into several pages of descriptions about what that means. This novel quantitative approach uses dwelling feature shape and size as a proxy for social and settlement change, considering these changes at the scale of the house. So that's my supplemental method, because again, this is a why is the method, why do we choose this method? And I've pointed out here very specifically that this is a novel quantitative approach. So it's novel, meaning we don't think anybody's done it before, and quantitative, meaning that we used numbers, right? We measured things and used statistics rather than using qualitative approaches, which is what most people had done before, right? So this is our argument for our method. Again, our supplemental to the method. Now our findings and conclusion. Findings. We find that during the woodland period, dwelling size was overall slightly larger in New England than on the Maritime Peninsula, but ranges heavily overlapped. After the introduction of horticulture, however, dwellings in New England grew in size overall and assumed bimodally distinct larger and smaller forms, which led to the necessity of restructuring the social and economic behavior. That's it. We just told you what we found. That's the answer, right? So hopefully you're seeing this linkage, right? We had a research question that said we're going to try and understand this fact about house shape in relationship to horticulture. Then we had a method. We're going to use a quantitative approach, looking at individual houses to try and assess this relationship. And then in our findings here, we tell you what we found. We found very specifically this information. Again, there's more. Just, of course, if you want to see the data, if you want to see the math we use, you have to go into the paper. But everything else you need is right here. And finally, our conclusions summed up in one little sentence here. This is the central nugget of our interpretation. This pattern correlates maize horticulture with changes in social and economic lifestyle in late woodland New England. That's the whole point of the paper. We wanted to make an argument that that was true. So those are our conclusions or our interpretations, right? So this is quite a complex version of an abstract. Probably at the undergraduate level, you're going to be writing something a bit simpler than this. But the idea here is that there's a format here. There's a structure here that you can use for any abstract, for any kind of a paper that I think works. And it's certainly the one that I use. All right. Thanks, everybody.